I've had everything from people coming into the office with guns. I had one of my factories burnt to the ground and everything in between. And, went through some very, very dark times, suffered from depression because I was pretty much on my own. I had nothing. Therapy has allowed me to understand what were the things that actually sat behind those feelings of anxiety at the time and those issues. One might look at me and say, well, hold on, you've got 2 businesses and 2 podcasts. You don't sound that lazy. But I'm lazy in the sense that I'm always looking for ways to make my life easier. You've got to absolutely, remove your ego from the business.
Welcome to the Bay HQ podcast, where we inspire, connect and guide the next generation of British Asians. Today we have with us Aarish Shah, who's the founder of EmergeONE, the founder of Projected, and the host of Nothing Ventured and Off Balance. How are you doing today?
Really well, thanks, Omar. Great to be here with you. Really excited to do this.
So you've got one of the longest LinkedIns I've ever seen. So we're going to try and cover as much as we can on the important bits during this episode. And when you're growing up, right, did you ever believe you'd be doing all the stuff you're doing now?
So actually, probably not. So the interesting thing is, growing up, I was part of a massively entrepreneurial family. We're a sort of 3rd generation family business operating out of Africa and Australasia and North America. And I guess growing up, I always anticipated that I would join the family business and do that. So I didn't really think about doing anything for myself. It wasn't until a lot later in life that I actually embarked out on my own and started doing my own thing. But as a young person, I was massively interested in pretty much everything. I'm a huge generalist. And, I was very lucky and fortunate to be exposed to kind of business ideas from a pretty early age, to the extent that, as a teenager, I was, bootlegging kind of mixtapes in school until the deputy head got hold of me and told me, no more. But, I grew up during the 80s and 90s. I was massively privileged and was, in an independent school. With hindsight, is actually the wrong place to breed entrepreneurialism, because these schools really, what they do is they take pretty bright individuals and turn them into kind of middle managers, and you're sort of put on that path of being a lawyer, doctor, accountant, or maybe working in banking, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's something to be said about, schooling the creativity out of people, and we need to get back to kind of schooling that creativity back in. Again, I was fortunate. I was doing lots of creative things. I did drama, I did music, and that allowed me to keep that kind of creative side of my brain working. But yeah, as I say, for me, entrepreneurialism was what my family was. It was, it was baked in. And it wasn't until sort of I got into the business that I realized that a lot of what we were doing was what I would call entrepreneurialism. So rather than focusing on how do you grow and expand beyond, it was more about managing and running the businesses, which, ultimately for me, I'm someone who I think probably has undiagnosed ADHD, became quite sort of frustrating quite quickly because it was never new. You were just sort of doing the same thing.
Before you started the family business, were you excited by joining the family business, or was it just something you felt like you were going to do? Was there an excitement there? Was it like you really wanted to go and join it? Or?
The backstory to that is kind of incredible as well. I got married, well, not married, but I met my now wife very young, just in my final year of university, and she actually fell pregnant during that time. And obviously I come from a South Asian background. I'm Indian by origin, of Kenyan birth, and my wife was Italian, and it was quite not the done thing, if I can put it that way, putting it mildly. So there was a period where I didn't actually think I was going to join the family business, and I started off, as most people do in kind of a normal career, if I can put it that way, but with also having a young child to provide for, and my partner as was, and now my wife. And it wasn't until sort of several years into that journey that I did join the family business. But I would definitely say that it was something that was baked into my ethos, right? In that the family business was something that had been, quote unquote, sold to me from a very young age. There was no questioning whether I would or wouldn't join at some point, at least for me internally. And so it was always something that I knew at some part of my life, some stage of my life, I'd be doing. The reality is, again, when you're young, you have certain expectations about how things might be, and you have rose-tinted glasses to some extent. And for me, the family business was something that was vastly important and, an essential part of my life. So yeah, I mean, for sure, it was definitely something that I knew I was going to do. Was I excited about it? I'm not sure. I think I was excited about carrying on this legacy of 3 generations, in fact, more than 3 generations, to be honest now. And, hopefully helping to build something that, my grandfather and his brothers had started off back in, the 1900s.
Yeah. And just remember that period where imagine, so you've got a new baby,
Yeah.
and your whole life you've been building up to you're going to work for the family business, and that's now potentially been taken away from you. What was that like mindset like then, right? And if you said you're going into a normal job, what was the driver there? Was it just necessity? Was it like, how did you cope with all of that? Because it would be a hell of a lot of pressure, one as being a young father, but also then having what was your future life just seemingly pulled away from you.
I'd love to say I coped with it well, but I was a 20-year-old, 22-year-old or something along those lines. And yeah, it was completely out of necessity. In fact, what had happened was I'd headed out to Italy where my daughter was born. She's wonderful. She's actually in a final stages of university. So I'm blessed to have an incredible daughter in her and in my second daughter who was born several years later. But in Italy, it was impossible to find a job. I, had a UK degree, which wasn't recognized. And in Italy, things work very differently. I studied languages at university. And whilst here in the UK, you can pretty much go into any role with any degree, the only things you need to be trained in are very specific professions, such as, law and medicine and so on. So in Italy, it was just, there was no way I was going to get a job. So after about 3 or 4 months there, we came back to the UK and completely out of necessity, found a role and was initially a temp role. Built from there and learned. And I think, one of the things that I'm, again, hugely fortunate about is, I have an ability, I guess, to synthesize new skills and new information pretty quickly. But I think the most important thing that happened at the time was one of the elders in the family, who sadly has now passed away. He said to me, Aarish, life is like a bottle of Coke. When you open it up, everything rushes to the top. But just give it time and things will settle. And that's precisely really what happened. But, to an extent was blessed, because if I hadn't have joined PwC, BPO, Nortel and Deutsche Bank as I did in those early years, I wouldn't have qualified as a chartered management accountant, quite likely. I wouldn't have actually been able to build the life that I've since been able to build, because the skills that I learned, I learned VLOOKUP, reconciling 27 accounts over the course of one night, because things hadn't been done for a couple of years or whatever. I self-taught myself a bunch of stuff that I think otherwise I probably wouldn't have.
And then you said when you went into family business, it was different to how you expected, but you were there for some time, right? It was about 9 years. So.
Yeah, it was about close to 10 years. Yeah. So it's different from the perspective that you're working within the constraints of what has already been built, rather than going out and building something new. I think most family businesses, well, I say most, but a lot of family businesses can be quite cautious. There's also, there's a saying that you go from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. So your first generation is the visionary generation. It kind of starts things up. Second generation builds on what was built, and the third generation often, to use a colloquialism, spaffs it up the wall because they're just not engaged, or they don't have the motivation. But I was highly motivated and very curious, and a lot of the things I did when I joined the family business was to change the way things were done in the sort of operations I was working in, mainly around data, actually, funny enough, providing our sales team with how they were tracking on a daily basis, giving them KPIs and objectives. And within the first few months, it sort of tripled revenue and was doing some interesting stuff. And let's face it, also operating, this was out in Papua New Guinea, which for those of your listeners that don't know is the back end of nowhere, north of Australia, a hugely challenging environment to be in. I've had everything from people coming into the office with guns. I had one of my factories burnt to the ground, and everything in between. At a political level, we had at one stage 2 prime ministers, 2 chiefs of police, both sort of vying for that top slot. And, we went through a period where Exxon came in and built a $27 billion LNG plant. It completely inflated the economy and then came crashing right back down again when they stopped the build phase. So I often call it an MBA by experience, because you're at the coalface, you're doing things that you wouldn't do in a office job sitting in London. Yeah. We're working with suppliers in Southeast Asia. Impossible to find great management. You'd have to insource that from India or the Philippines or Australia or New Zealand or wherever it might be. That could take 6-8 months to get a visa or a work permit. And we had scenarios where I'd hired in sort of controllers into the business, and they'd been waiting so long for their visas that they simply said, well, we've taken a job elsewhere. And so I at various points was like acting CFO. I was the CEO. I was, helping with the ops. Not that I did this very often, but I remember like offloading a container whilst I was there. And you just learn how to do things when you don't have technology supporting you, when you have limited processes and systems. We had, when I first went out there, there was relatively little coverage, if any at all, for mobile infrastructure. It wasn't until about 2007, 2008, when Digicel came out there, that they really brought mobile and data to the country. People were still writing checks to make payments when I left. There wasn't really online banking in the way that we recognize it. So, these are all incredibly interesting challenges to overcome as someone in business, because you have to learn how to deal with those things in a way that today we really don't. We don't even think about.
What's really interesting there is about how it's such a different experience to also working in an office in London, right? But there's a reason why most people don't go and do business in Papua New Guinea, right? Because you said it's so tough. They had all these different challenges. Was there any point where you're like, why am I doing this? Why don't I just go back to London and take it the easy route? What kind of kept you in that challenging environment? Because obviously you had the choice to come back to something more easier.
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and it's one that I think about a lot. So in the first 5 years of my time there, my wife and my daughters were out there with me for the most part. There was a period when my wife came back to have our second daughter. But for the second 5 years, or 4 or 5 years that I was out there, they were living in Brisbane and then Melbourne, and I was traveling to and from Papua New Guinea. And that became hugely stressful, and, went through some very, very sort of dark times, suffered from depression, because I was pretty much on my own out there. I would say that I probably stuck it out longer than I should have. I was probably there 3 years more than I probably would have wanted to have been. And that was for a couple of reasons. That was loyalty to the family, for sure. It was also probably apathy on my part. It's easier to do what you're doing than make a change. But what essentially I learned was that I'd stopped learning. By the last few years, I'd stopped learning. And again, going back to what I was saying, I'm a massive generalist. I enjoy a lot of variety. As you mentioned earlier, there's 2 businesses and 2 podcasts, keeps me relatively busy today. In those days, I was doing the same thing again and again, and that actually, it turns out, is not where my skill set lies. It's not what I'm good at. It's not what I enjoy doing. And so when we finally made the decision, I have to say the decision was predominantly made by my wife and me together, but it was driven by my wife. Her family's all in Italy. She doesn't love traveling, and she wanted to be closer to her family. Ultimately, you've got to think about what is important in life. And whilst my family is massively important to me, and what they've built is massively important both to me and in its own right, I had to look after my immediate family as well and do what was right for them. But the thing that kept me there to an extent was the challenges. Like, I would get very bored sitting in an office doing the same thing day in, day out, which ultimately was what happened out there. But I think, having worked in those environments in Deutsche Bank and PwC and Nortel, they're great at the early stage of my career because I learned a bunch from them. I learned from the people around me, had some great mentors, but I fast outgrew those sort of environments. And I'm just not the sort of person that can sit in an office and do the same job. And also, I think I have an inherent issue with kind of authority. So I struggle to be told what to do, and I like taking my own path.
So you also mentioned there about the dark times and the depression as well, right? And as we were talking before the podcast started as well, how we're both in therapy at the moment and how big a thing that is, right? And I think a lot of times people who are entrepreneurial, for example, even people who are leaders in different fields, right? Because they're putting so much pressure on themselves, and we have this cultural stigma in many ways that still exists, and we're trying to get rid of it, about people taking therapy, especially if you're in a high-powered situation, right? Because people think, oh, can they not handle it, whatever it is. But you said how much therapy has helped you. So I'd love to just, if you could share that with the audience.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, I did a bit of therapy when I was out there and going through those times, and that really helped. Coaching also helped, although I only did a couple of sessions, but it helped me actually figure out how to take the next step and come here. I was massively anxious about coming back to the UK because I had nothing. I had no network. I had no balance sheet of my own. I had nothing, to work with. And I really didn't know what I was going to do. And I also didn't know where I fit, I think is probably the best way of putting it. But I really started therapy in earnest just under a year ago. There's a couple of things, right? So firstly, therapy is a sign of strength, I think, rather than a sign of weakness. People who are doing therapy often go into it to discover more about themselves and understand how to cope with the things that are challenging in their lives. For me, that was things like alcohol. It was things like relationships. It was things like what drives me to do the things that I'm doing. And I found it massively valuable in a way that I think you can do lots of things to kind of do self-discovery, as we were saying earlier as well. But actually you have to go really deep into yourself to understand what motivates you and what drives you, and what are the things that trigger you as well. And I think this is the important thing. And to go back a step, when I was out in New Guinea as an example, there were times where we were struggling with making payroll when our factory burned to the ground. Like, we had to let a whole bunch of our employees go, clearly. And, we had banks to pay, we had clients that were reliant on us for materials, we had suppliers to pay, et cetera, et cetera. And those were really tough times. And I didn't know how to extract myself from the business. Like, to me, my ego was really wrapped up in the business. I kind of saw that as me. And what therapy, I managed to overcome a lot of that just through the learnings, right? But I went through that pain at the time. But the therapy has allowed me to kind of enhance those learnings and understand, okay, what were the things that actually sat behind those feelings of anxiety at the time and those issues, rather than focusing on, well, okay, how did I deal with it? It was more about, well, what caused me to feel like that in the first place? And I mean, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give to founders all the time is, you are not your business. You've got to absolutely, remove your ego from the business. You've got to treat it as, a completely separate entity, which it is in law, right? Like, your business is not you, because, things can go up, things can go down, and you don't want your mental health to suffer as a result, right? Nothing is that important. Nothing is so important that, it destroys your relationships. It destroys your relationship with yourself. It leaves you burnt out and in pain. And 100% in the South Asian, the Indian community, for sure, mental health is still not something we talk about enough. There's stigma around therapy. There's stigma around people being diagnosed with mental health conditions. But the reality is that they exist. And actually, if we destigmatize, going out, reaching out, getting help, then actually we'll have a better, more thriving, more inclusive community as a result. Couldn't recommend, taking the steps to either find mentors or coaching or therapy, whatever is right for you at whatever stage of life you're at. But I definitely think that, for me, it's helped me build better relationships with my family, my wife, my daughters, but also with my parents and others. And it's helped me understand myself.
There's so many people who have quite large platforms who always talk about how the whole hustle culture mentality, right?
Sure.
And a lot of it comes down to this idea. For example, I see it about relationships in particular, right? Where somebody might say, oh, you need to make sure that anybody you date knows that the business comes first, then them. Or like, and it's just like, is that really the message you want to put out there? But there's people sharing these messages, millions of followers, people reshare it. And there's this idea, it's kind of a siege mentality that I think sometimes people try to instill. It's easy in some ways to target entrepreneurs, right? Because like you said, the ego and the security and your identity is here from your business. If you keep telling them you need to, anything that attacks your business is attacking you. If people aren't supporting you, they're against you. It's like, a lot of my friends, like, they don't necessarily need to listen to every podcast. It's like, I don't listen to everything they do. It's like, my friends are doctors. I don't know how many lives they've saved in that day. If they're an accountant, I don't know how many spreadsheets they've done. So why, if you're in the public sphere, you're doing your own business, do you expect everybody to spend so much time on what you're doing, right? They can be friends of you for the person you are beyond that. And that's a really important thing, I think, for so many people, is that you are somebody beyond just your business, right? And it's a mistake I think a lot of people make, is they give up the hobbies. They give up the stuff they're doing on the side. And then you do just start to become your business. If you don't have anything else around you, what do you talk about? If all you're doing is your business. And it's really important, I think, for people to, like you said, like, make sure you've got other stuff going on, whether it's relationships, whether it's got hobbies, whether it's just things you just do for fun, just for you, right? Your own time, self-care.
It's balance, right? And I think, the pandemic highlighted how desperate people are for balance. The fact that people have been able to work from home, those of us that have been lucky enough to do that, realize that actually, spending that extra hour with my kid in the morning, or, being present at dinner in the evening, actually is hugely valuable. Being able to go out for that half an hour walk, 40-minute walk, it just adds so much value to your life that you can't really quantify, but it's immediately noticeable. And I think, hustle culture is something that I absolutely despise, I abhor. a lot of it's performative. Ultimately, it is, oh, look at me. I'm constantly online or on. I've seen a lot of stuff of late, and I think it'll happen again because we're in this sort of down cycle generally in the kind of early stage ecosystem, certainly, where, if you aren't working 24/7, then are you actually doing a disservice to your investor? Well, no, you're not. You, in fact, if anything, you're doing a disservice to your investors if you are working that much, because at some point you will burn out.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of, I don't take a holiday, or I have my laptop with me when I'm on holiday or whatever. And okay, cool, you do you. I mean, if that's what gives you pleasure in life, great. But try having 2 kids and doing that. It doesn't work, right?
It's also having a good relationship with those 2 kids, right? That's the important thing, right? Some people have 2 kids who they have no relationship with because they're working all the time. I was like, is that how you want to live your life? Is that, when you look back on your life, what are you going to regret more?
100%. And it's definitely something that I regret. I mean, I spent 5 years effectively as an absent father. I think I was doing sort of 2 weeks there, 1 week back at home, or 3 weeks, 2 weeks, whatever it was. And, I missed lots of my children's, major sort of life events. And actually, I've been working at home, from home rather, for the last sort of, 3 years maybe. And that's just given me such a massive insight into my younger daughter, how she is and what she does and what motivates her and what she loves doing. And there's nothing that compares. I'm like, as you say, do you want to die saying, well, I built $1 billion business, but I've got no one to share it with because I have no friends and family, because I basically just, threw them under the bus or carved them out of my life. So no, I mean, I think, and look, there will always be people that will prioritize one thing over the other. For me, family, relationships, friends, they're an important part of my life, and I wouldn't want to be in a position where they were secondary, right? Yeah. They'll always come first. But that's not to say that you can't be great at business as well. The thing about business is not about keeping yourself busy. It's doing things smart. It's figuring out ways actually to do more whilst doing less. And I think a lot of people, especially founders, because they have this propensity to try and do everything themselves, end up doing everything themselves mediocrely rather than doing a few things really well. And I think if more of us sort of concentrated on focus on what we're great at doing and then give the stuff we're not good at doing to other people, we probably live more balanced lives.
And I think what's interesting there as well is how the whole performative side of it, right? And it's like, you should be focusing on your results, or let's say your impact that you're making. If the biggest thing you can boast about is how hard you work, but you haven't got any customers, or you haven't done anything, you haven't helped anybody, that's not the point of pride. Where sometimes it's almost an Olympics of who's worked the hardest, rather than who's making the biggest impact, who's changing. If you're what is your company's mission? Are you actually achieving that mission? That's what you should measure your success against, rather than how hard you're working.
It's because it's the incentives are wrong, right? So the incentive to post about stuff is to get followers. Who are the followers? Followers are people that will look up to you and potentially, value what you're saying. They're not going to be interested in, okay, I added another 100 customers. Maybe they are, I don't know. But they will be interested in, okay, this guy's a successful, theoretically, entrepreneur or whatever. I want to emulate them. Well, what do they do? Oh, well, they work, 24/7, etc. And the reality is controversy sells. So, the more controversial you can be, the more likely it is that you're going to get eyeballs and clicks and equally, I was talking to, the producer of my podcast, Nothing Ventured Off Balance. He goes, the best thing that can happen is for people to come on and basically tell you why you're wrong, because then you can engage with them and get them, onto the podcast and talk about, well, why do you think I'm wrong and so on. And that's where we're at, with social media, especially. Part of it is clickbait. Part of it is saying things to generate, eyeballs, because eyeballs drive traffic. And ultimately, if you are trying to sell a product or a service, driving more traffic to you is going to help drive traffic, one hopes, to your businesses. And I think that's why a lot of people do it. Yeah. I take the view, you just got to be yourself. That's the best way of being online. Just be authentic.
So with me, right, is if I'm talking about how hard I'm working, I'm talking about it as a problem. I'm complaining about it. I'm working too hard. Mm-hmm. And if, like you said, it's me not giving up things that I need to be giving up. And sometimes it is difficult to actually make that switch. But I complain about it to let people know this is what I'm doing wrong. So if I keep saying it out loud, sooner or later someone's just bloody do it, right? Stop complaining about it and just Like I know, for example, like one of the things I'm doing, like over the weekend probably, is making a bunch of videos about stuff that I'm doing at the moment that we can then hire an intern to do. And if you're listening right now and you want to work for us, let us know, because we've got plenty of work that I don't want to be doing more that we can get somebody else to do. But I think that's where we tie that into with EmergeONE, right? Because you were being a CFO, right, for multiple companies, and you realized, well, why don't I just make this a lot easier? And rather than me being me all the time doing this individually, you can do EmergeONE and you can do Projected as well, because it's how do you scale up, right?
EmergeONE's an interest. So I'm someone that does things relatively emergently. I didn't necessarily have a set goal in mind, right? What I saw was, I'd come back to the UK. I'd been CFO in an ed tech startup, which is JV between Eton College and Founders Factory. So I was immensely, again, privileged, right? The first thing that I did back in the UK, I was sat 10 foot away from Brent Hoberman and learned like about startups, at the ground floor of what is now, one of the most prolific accelerators in the UK and becoming globally as well now. And I realized there was this gap in the market for portfolio sort of fractional CFO work with venture businesses. So I started doing that and then realized a bunch of things. So one, there's a limit to the number of businesses that I could work with. There's a limit to the amount of time that I have to work, right? So I can't scale myself. How do I do that? So the first thing was like, I don't like working with one business. How do I scale that? Well, I can work with multiple as a portfolio. And then I realized I can't scale myself. How do I do that? I was getting approached by sort of CFOs and FDs who they liked the content that I put out. They realized that I'd built some great relationships. So I started putting them into roles. And in 2020, as the pandemic hit, like I just doubled down on that and built, EmergeONE into what it is today, which is, a consultancy that provides CFO support to venture-backed tech startups and scale-ups. And that is very much our niche. And it's exactly, what we do and what I'm proud of doing. And absolutely. So the way to scale an agency is you've got to bring people in that sit, not necessarily underneath you, but can deliver the services that you're providing. And again, it comes back, actually, everything comes back from this inherent laziness that I have, right? So one might look at me and say, well, hold on, you've got 2 businesses and 2 podcasts. You don't sound that lazy. Like, yeah, I'm not lazy in the sense that I don't want to do anything, but I'm lazy in the sense that I'm always looking for ways to make my life easier, whether that's learning, macros when I was 22, 23 years old and automating the processes I was working on, whether that's today now learning to write Python badly and figuring out maybe ways of automating that. And actually Projected, again, was born out of that same idea. Well, okay, we're now, we're an agency, we're dealing with, however many clients we've got. But how do you scale that further? And how do you scale that more? And so the thought process I had was, there are millions, there's 5.8 million SMEs in the UK. There's 30 million in the US, right? There's a lot of small businesses and they contribute a lot of the GDP of any nation, but they're underserved, right? Most of them can't afford a CFO. Most of them, they have an owner manager who's sort of getting along. And Projected for me was, how do I virtualize myself? How do I actually make myself redundant? And this is always a thought process I have. How do I make myself redundant and move to the next thing? How do we get the core financial information that businesses need straight to their inbox? And that's what we're doing. We haven't built a dashboard, we built an email, and that's counterintuitive for a lot of people. But as someone that's been a CFO and a founder, ultimately everything I do is about communication. The numbers are sort of 10%. Comms is about 90%. So, so for me, Projected was just a natural extension of what we were doing at EmergeONE, is how do we scale that up further? And indeed, nothing ventured and off balance are both sort of further extensions of that, because that's how do I share the knowledge and understanding and help people learn about venture or about business in a way that is accessible and meaningful from people like them. And one of the things, at Nothing Venture that I'm really proud of is that I built that podcast to be as diverse as possible. So, we have, our guests have been sort of, 50% female, 50% minority ethnic, because these are the voices that make up the world. And why aren't we hearing from them?
So it's incredible, like what you've got to now. And like, there's so much to try and cover in the episode there. So we'll have to get you on in the future again to see like what the progress is on with where you've got to as well. But let's jump to the quick fire questions. Who are 3 British Asians you'd love to shout out that you think the audience should be following and listening to?
Really hard to give you 3. I'll shout out a couple of people for sure. So Gautam Sahgal is the CEO of Perkbox. He has been a friend and advisor and investor in Projected. He is an awesome, one of the most kind human beings you'll ever meet, really down to earth, but really giving with his time as well. Rajan Desanjay, another one of my investors, again, has been just like, he's actually been a massive support, when things haven't been going great. He's there to kind of pep me up and make sure I'm on track. And then there are so many others that I could mention, but like all the CFOs at Projected, at EmergeONE, I couldn't do what I do without them. My CTO Kaylee at Projected and my front end dev Stella and my CMO Ben. They've built the product to what it is today. I've just sort of tinkered at the edges, I would say.
So thank you so much for coming on. Have you got any final words to the audience?
One thing that I learned late in life is always back yourself, right? Don't listen to what other people have to say. Don't hold yourself up to other people's standards. Hold yourself up to your own. Look for help because people are always willing to help, but always be yourself. And, the final thing I would say in closing is serendipity is the most amazing thing in life. Build relationships for relationships' sake. Don't expect anything to come out of them, but when things do, they can be magical. As I found with this podcast, it's been really great to be here. Thanks, Amar. Really appreciate it.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for listening. It means a huge amount to us, and we don't think you realize how important you are. Because if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, if you leave us a 5-star review, it makes a world of difference. And if you believe in what we're trying to do here, to inspire, connect and guide the next generation of British Asians. If you do those things, you can help us achieve that mission and you can help us make a bigger impact. And by doing that, it means we can get bigger guests, we can host more events, we can do more for the community. So you can play a huge part. So thank you so much for supporting us.